Thank you, Tom. Thank you to all my colleagues for the introduction, and welcome to this, the first talk of this virtual international conference for 2021. I think most of us will have experienced in some way the increased stresses and changes of circumstances over the past year and a half in both in the workplace and in our homes. And I think it's easy then to understand, as I find my screen to share with you. There we go. It's easy then to understand that many individuals turn to food and drink to gain some degree of comfort and control during troubled times. As we reflect over the past year and a half, it's interesting to note how we've needed to adapt socially, domestically, technically, and also physically and mentally. Importantly, the UK government recognises that obesity is one of the biggest health crises the country faces. Almost 2/3, 63% of adults in England are now overweight or living with obesity, and 1 in 3 children leave primary school overweight or obese, with obesity-related illnesses costing the NHS over £6 billion a year. The urgency to tackle obesity, this obesity time bomb, has been brought to the fore by evidence of the links to its increased risk from COVID-19. Living with excess weight puts people at increased risk of serious illness or death from COVID-19, with the risk growing substantially by increased BMI as it increases. And nearly 8% of the critically ill patients with COVID-19 in intensive care units were obese, compared to 2.9% of the population. In my talk today, I'm going to be talking about clients presenting conditions, their experiences, and sharing some of my own learning from the changes made throughout the past year and a half. Accepting that I could work online was one of my personal hurdles. How was it going to work? What new technology had to be investigated, navigated, learned, and would clients be able to access and work online easily? What were the implications of lockdown, the increased new stresses caused and made worse by a pandemic? The commonality in the presenting symptoms of the most prevalent of my cases in my caseload over the past year and a half, specifically where mood and food and drink had been an issue. In a study by Rogers et al. In 2020 into people who had recovered from severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, they found that there were long-term increases in susceptibility to depression, anxiety, and fatigue. And we have yet to discover the true implications of long COVID. What changes were needed to take place to my regular therapy techniques and methods to enable working online safely? And the problems that I and my clients encountered with technology and distant working. So accepting that it was possible at all to work online. If you had asked me 2 years ago if I would swap my clinical face-to-face practice for online therapy sessions, I would have categorically and emphatically told you absolutely not. That was then, and here we are now. And then came COVID. And suddenly my clinic was no longer a safe environment to work in. We were told to close our doors and stay at home, and yet the phone still rang. People needed help, reassurance, someone to talk to, support. They were asking still to see. It had started slowly at first, and then suddenly, almost overnight, I found myself using Skype and Zoom, video calls. Of course, the BSCH had been talking about working online for a number of years, but I hadn't ever felt that it was quite right for me in my own clinic environment until, that is, COVID hit. Someone once told me that when you are ready, the right things are made known to you. and you become aware of how you can use them and make them part of your world. I like that philosophy. And as I set about learning how to work online, more things seemed suddenly possible. This was in no little way helped by observing a video class and watching students from a wide demographic experiencing exactly online what they would have done within my own classroom. A class of students experiencing a trance state, being awoken safely, and reporting exactly as they would have done in any classroom their own individual experiences of trance. So if it was possible to use hypnosis safely within the classroom, it absolutely had to be transferable into the clinic situation. I was almost ready when a phone call came from an old returning client who was in distress. "Listen, I can't see you in clinic at the moment," I said, "but do you have a smartphone or a laptop? And I can send you a link to a virtual clinic. We can talk. If you can find a place where you can be undisturbed for a few minutes." "Oh yes," I said. "We use Zoom for the kids. We've been using it for their education and for exercise classes online." And before I'd really thought about it any longer, I was having my first clinical hypnotherapeutic session with a client where I used hypnosis with confidence for the first time. The impact of COVID-19 meant that people were experiencing isolation and overcrowding, increased risks to their own health, lack of control, the threat and loss of their jobs, their career, their identity, their home, their routine. They were feeling overwhelmed, and there were demands and expectations placed upon them that they weren't ready for. It was quickly very obvious that some clients were turning to food and drink to help them get through their days and nights, either feeling isolated or as a method to cope with overcrowding, lack of space, with seemingly no escape. NHS staff members, a frontline worker who was overworked and trying hard to manage her home and her family with no time to take proper breaks, was one of the first people I encountered. And then a working mum with children at home, trying to homeschool and work from home herself, doing her own job, and sometimes with not enough technology to share. And for one mum in particular, cooking with the children had become a fun way of spending time using weights and measures as part of their education. But the result of cooking cake every day soon had quite another unforeseen consequence. Men, two in particular, who had in the past had reason to be out of doors, found themselves in the way, in their words, not mine. With no pub, no club, no social interaction, no football or exercise to speak of, except their one solitary hour each day, things were starting to become difficult, and drinking and snacking at home started to be the norm for them. And as a consequence, they were starting to demonstrate and show the evidence of increased weight and a beer belly. For one young lady, finding her enclosed and restricted environment gave her no escape from the frustrations of her partner, and found her turning to the comforts of food and drink that she might otherwise, in other circumstances, not have had. Adding to her desperation and her distress. Panic buying meant that people bought what they could afford and what was available to them on the shelves in whatever stores they could. Often this was cheap and refined food, heavily processed with a long shelf life. Not the fresh, healthy fruit and veg that was needed. For some, it was the isolation, not seeing other people and being completely alone, or just feeling very alone and isolated, even when they were surrounded by others with no escape. Overwhelmed and overcrowded, everyone underfoot. The only positive things about 2020 in England was the incredible weather that we had that year. If you could get out to safe distance and take your 1 hour's daily exercise, fear of catching COVID was tangible. And for those with underlying conditions who were shielding or had vulnerable partners or family members to care for, almost had to hide away. The loss of control and the freedom impacted on everyone. Most people were concerned for their jobs, for their careers, for their income, for their freedom, their family health, both physical and mental health. In a piece of research by Terry et al. In 2020, they investigated the links with mood changes that were associated with COVID-19, noting that there was an increased risk to mental health and to eating disorders. There were commonalities in the presenting triggers: anxiety, depression, guilt and loneliness, fear of death and COVID-19 were tangible, loss and grief, feeling out of control and unstable and insecure, plain exhaustion, feeling overwhelmed. The results of eating and drinking excessively or of poor diet is weight gain, gaining fat. Just carrying too much weight in our bodies increases the risk to our health, increasing the risk of high blood pressure, prediabetes, cardiovascular disease, joint pain, joint disease. And the list goes on and on and on. I've already mentioned Terry et al.'s research that concluded that elevated tension and stress created increases in depression from COVID-19, had correlated to decreased energy, increasing fatigue and confusion and mood disturbance. And for many of my clients, being overweight resulted in self-soothing, self-loathing, using food and drink to numb, block temporarily the anxiety and the depression, the symptoms of COVID-19, creating just an ongoing cycle. A quick unconscious fix of carbs, of sugars, of alcohol to boost their energy reserves and get back to coping with whatever was required just wasn't enough. And it was just that, a quick mindless fix, which with often empty calorific value and didn't actually sustain in any way, but just added to the fat stores and gave briefly a momentarily pleasure, a dopamine fix. It was seemingly an endless cycle with no end in sight. And in fact, by lockdown number 3 in December 2020, many of my clients were feeling hopeless. My sessions saw 78% of female versus 22% of male split coming for weight loss. But where alcohol was a big contributor, the split was more 48% female and 52 male. We're not talking about alcoholism here. We're just talking about an increase in the use of alcohol to numb, just as food was becoming a numbing quality to help cope. Looking back over my notes, I note also that women presented with more anxiety, where men listed depression and frustration, anger between February 2020 and 2021. The changes needed for safe practice and setting up working. What they needed, what we needed as therapists, script changes that needed to be adapted. Working from their own space meant that our clients didn't need to travel. They were relaxed in their own surroundings. Always ensuring that clients had a reasonable chance of being undisturbed while working, somewhere they could sit comfortably and could position laptops and computers, smartphones and facilities, had good observation, reduced distractions to a minimum. All took a little while to perfect, but quickly formed part of an initial introduction talk. Paperwork, terms and conditions all went online and were available for clients to download. Permission to contact GPs were done differently now if needed. There were several changes to my formal awakening script too. An initial induction would now included statements about awakening at the end of a session if it was needed due to loss of signal or interruptions. And an agreed telephone number was given so that I could ring and they would answer to check that all was well if we lost a signal or were cut off in mid-therapy session. The physical energetic link of two people in the same room is different, and it's taken a little while for me to adapt to that. I can't tell you that working online is exactly the same as sitting in front of someone in the same room, but it certainly can be adapted to. And I can tell you that I'm aware that there is a different vigilance. You note a different nuance. You build a different way of building rapport. It takes a little longer. It's not something we have quite as much control over as we did in private practice face-to-face, but it certainly does work, and much better than I would have thought. My method of working with presenting conditions of weight loss, especially eating and drinking, is to do behavioural works first. In the main and in the majority of clients, we work with direct suggestion. Small achievable goals, regular self-hypnosis, and mindfulness practice. A few clients needed more dissociative techniques, wounding in a child and parts work. The attention-seeking inner child made demands for sweets, fatty foods, high carbs, and who can blame them? They were acting out and acting out of control, and they needed to be reassociated to get control back during lockdown. The problem with technology and distance work is that in the same way that it's always been challenging to set self-hypnosis and outside work for the therapy room with individuals to change their behavior and to monitor those changes, now without scales to weigh someone in clinic, the ability to check had to be done by trust. And so making a statement and making an agreement, a formal agreement, became something that I discussed right up front with my weight control clients. You may choose not to do any of the changes I suggest or that we agree, and that's fine. But if you do them, then you will see the changes that you wish to make happen faster. And we make it a formal agreement to agree to those changes. So the distractions that we encountered working online, well, I'm sure you've probably all encountered exactly the same ones. Dogs and cats, postal deliveries, phone calls, message alerts, pings and bleeps from phones in the distance, children interrupting. Very recently, I was working in a lunch break with a client who worked in a hangar, and we were in deep trance as very slowly behind him, I could see the hangar doors very slowly being opened and a small plane rolled in behind him. And we just carried on. Signal strength of broadband is not great in the West Country. We've battled through signal dropouts, extreme weather conditions, weak links and power cuts. And if that wasn't bad enough, I decided that I'd move house. And for a while I had no direct broadband. Instead, I battled with a British Telecom BT Mini Hub. And I don't know whether you have anything similar, but a mobile hub isn't the greatest at receiving a steady signal. And the only room in my house where you could get a signal was by dangling out of an upstairs window and holding it about 2 feet outside. And that wasn't great. So for 2 months, I drove to the top of a local hill and worked from the back of my car in a lay-by. It was the only way I could get a strong enough signal and a stable enough signal to work online with video calls. We, my clients and I, have turned off the video on one side or the other, and sometimes both, to secure an optimal link, turned it back on as soon as we were able. We've made phone calls prior to our sessions to check signal strength, weather conditions. And in amongst all of it, throughout COVID, we've done some really good work. And so it's been an interesting time. It's been and still is very tempting to give up and not to change and not to adapt. It's been very tempting sometimes to go and find that drink, to go and find a slice of cake, a quick fix, a biscuit. But by changing a few simple things, by adapting, making healthy choices, and step by step reframing our goals, we've been able to find our way through COVID-19 and keep going. Now we face the future, living with the effects of long COVID and the after effects of our changed and ever-evolving world. And I, for one, am feeling more positive and optimistic about working online and the changes that we've made, and the benefits and the impact on my clinical practice and the client's symptomology and symptom recovery. As we change, we adapt, and as we adapt, we learn. We learn to survive, and we begin again as a business, as individuals, as therapists, to thrive. Thank you. I'm quite happy to take questions if anybody has left any.
Hi, Michelle. Hi, this is Anna here. Okay, yes, to the participants, please feel free to drop in these questions in the chat box. I've got one here for you, Michelle. You mentioned that you had to make some script changes to suit this new norm. Could you maybe share an example of that?
Yes, absolutely. The wake up script is really important to make sure that our clients wake up safely at the end of a session. And of course, if we've got no good signals, and if things change as we're working, and particularly in my environment, sometimes you get intermittent signals, relying on that 10-to-1 count up that we make isn't always enough at the end of a session. So sometimes we have to put that in right at the beginning, and quite often that's become a formalized part of my induction now, as I'm taking people from the initial eye closure and counting them down into a more relaxed state. I then put in that they will wake up absolutely at the end of our session, and I'll put in the time that our session is about to close, so that they will wake up safely at the end of that session, and they'll wake up feeling fine, and they'll wake up feeling refreshed. So it's a little modification, it's a little tweak, but it allows them to, whatever happens through the rest of the induction as they go deeper into trance, at the end of the session, knowing that they will wake up safely. So it's just a little tweak and an adjustment that needed to be made.
Yeah, I think you mentioned about the signal dropping, and I think it's very pertinent to have that in our script, as well as the managing the distractions that you mentioned, the delivery. So yeah, okay, and I think everyone resonates with the same feeling, because we're seeing some messages here saying that you basically shared what they've been facing for the past 1 year as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, I think it's very common. I think most people will have experienced and be able to resonate with exactly what those experiences are. I think it's not unique to me. I think it's unique to everybody that we've had to adapt and change, and that adaptation has applied to globally everyone. And that, I think, if we don't make those changes, if we don't learn to adapt, it doesn't just affect our health and our mental health, it affects our lifestyle, and going forward it's the way we learn to change and adapt and thrive. So yeah.
Yes. And okay, we have another question here. Did you need to adjust your pricing for remote sessions, because that would be totally a different setting from your usual setup here?
No, I absolutely didn't. No, I kept my pricing exactly the same. And in fact, when I started to work back face to face with clients, I was aware that I was spending a lot more time, because I had to deep clean in between each client face to face. So everything had to then be sanitized, and it became a longer session. So no, I didn't change my pricing at all.
Okay, that would make it easy when you go between sessions. Yeah, I think. Okay. We have a few more questions here, Michelle. So, okay. And so we've got one comment here from Fiona saying that, yeah, it was a good alternative to have the telephone number in case of the signal drop. So I think, yeah, that's a point you made, and that's a very important point. And okay, and we have another question from Anne. Do the clients have any reservations or fears about online? And how did you address this?
Yeah, I think we all did. I think absolutely the concerns that we had was that it wasn't going to work, that it was going to be a very different way of building rapport. But as I think I said to you, the nuances change. And I think as we all work online, even in conference now, as we all start to communicate, we start to look for slightly different things. We look for a different means of communication. Right at the moment, I'm looking at a rather large picture of myself. When I'm working with clients, I turn off my mini image because I find it distracting. So I find it easier to face them and talk to them directly without having the distraction of looking at my own features and checking my hair, or looking at what I'm saying, or looking at the room behind me. So I find it far better to focus on them directly, as I would do in a clinic situation, and disregard my own speech.
So I think that brings about, there's a comment from Nicola here saying that, are you able to pick up on their body language? But I think when you say that you've got a good view, I guess that's still possible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you modify what you're looking on at. Normally, when we look in therapy at the whole body and look for nuances and little tells that people make as they're talking, for incongruence when they say one thing and the body's doing something else, we don't see quite that. But when we learn to work with online work, we're working very much more with the face and the shoulders. But when we start to do the therapy, I like people to sit back so that I can do at least half the body, so that I can see the respiration and the breathing.
Yes.
So we kind of get them to sit back a little bit further. So yes, you can, and there are certain things that you do to modify that, but you are still picking up on very different types of nuances. And that comes with a little bit of work. It's not instant, and I'm only aware that I'm changing what I'm looking for in a subtle way.
And so there's a comment here as well saying that, from Fiona, saying that you can pick up so much more from your clients over the video because there's a short time lag. So maybe that's a plus point to having the... Okay, probably another last question. Okay, this is from Kathleen. Could you kindly expand on the idea of different vigilance?
Different vigilance?
Yes.
As in, and I think that's picking up on exactly what we've just said. It's that looking for those subtle shifts. Once you start to build the rapport online, it's a very much more focused way of observing someone. So as you're seeing them, as you're making that eye contact, the peripheral vision becomes much more honed in. There's an awareness. If I talk about a magnetic connection that you have, sometimes there's kind of an energetic vibe that you get very much more when you're working one-to-one, that I rely on. And that isn't quite there in the same way when you're working online. It takes a little longer to build that connection. I'm not saying it isn't there, because I think it is, but it takes just that little bit longer for me to build it. I'm never quite so comfortable in my first session when I'm working with someone online. The second session is better. I always feel that I've built something stronger in the second session. I guess that's true of most sessions, even face to face, but you do feel a connection more strongly when you're working face to face, I think.
So would you say that getting into trance, they take a little bit longer to sort of be comfortable into? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think so.
I have a nice point here by Pratap saying that clients are always on time because you can't blame the traffic, and traffic makes up the big blame in Malaysia. So I think that's very interesting. Okay, I think I know there are many other questions, but I think we may need to, there's a lot of questions for you, Michelle, but what we may do is we may take the questions and probably send it to you, and we would respond to the participants later. Thank you.
Thank you.